Carol Reardon will present the aftermath of the battle, the families of Gettysburg Union's dead versus the U.S. Pension Bureau. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about Carol Reardon. Dr. Reardon is the George Winfrey Professor of American History and Professor of Military History at Penn State University, where she specializes in the Civil War and the Vietnam eras. In addition to traditional classroom teaching, she specializes in the conduct of staff rides to Civil War battlefields, where she discusses the historical context of the art of war as leadership, logistics, and decision-making with military personnel from various armed forces. She is a past president of the Society for Military History and member of the Ambrose Bierce Project Advisory Board. She is the author of many articles and books, including Soldiers and Scholars, the U.S. Army and the Uses of Military History, 1865 to 1920, Pickett's Charge in History and Memory, Launch the Intruders, a naval attack squadron in the Vietnam War, 1972, and A Field Guide to Gettysburg, Experiencing the Battle Through Its History, Places, and People, co-written with William Thomas Vossler. Please join me in a warm Sacred Trust welcome for Dr. Carol Reardon.
Hello, everybody. Didn't have to move the microphone down this time. I prearranged it. Usually when I come and speak to you, I have some kind of an uplifting commentary, one that's usually good for a couple of major league laughs and something that's really kind of fun and entertaining and hopefully educational. This year will be a little bit of a break from that because I've come up with about as sad a subject as it's possible to come up with. Today is July the 6th. On July 6th, 1863, if you opened up many northern newspapers, you would have seen a very large headline. Unlike today's newspapers, which usually have one big masthead, one big headline across the masthead, usually during the Civil War era, you saw layers and layers of headlines in different sized types. They used some of the biggest type that they ever used during the Civil War to announce, at least in the Harrisburg newspaper, that the word from Gettysburg was so good that, in fact, Waterloo has been eclipsed. Now that's an awfully big claim to make. Waterloo eclipsed. For the first time, the Army of the Potomac had beaten Robert E. Lee. After 13 months of Robert E. Lee taking the Union Army's measure, there had been a resounding defeat here at Gettysburg. While most of the North was euphoric, however, there were hundreds of thousands of families, North and South, who were waiting for the cost of that victory or the cost of that defeat. A lot of us can remember watching a movie such as Gone with the Wind, where the crowds gathered around the newspaper offices waiting for the casualty list to be posted. That's how most Civil War families found out what happened to their loved one. They got a letter in the mail. They saw a notice in the newspaper. They would not get a telegram from the Army, from the War Department. No soldier would come and knock on their door to deliver the bad news in person. Some families never, ever found out what happened to their loved ones here at Gettysburg or on some other field. So today what I want to do is talk about some of those soldiers who did not survive to enjoy the fruits of victory here at Gettysburg. It's not a happy story, but it's an interesting story in its own way. The vehicle I've chosen to use to talk about this is something that was called the pension system. Now, when you hear the pension system, that's one of those words that tends to make people fall asleep really quickly. But this was a new experiment. Instead of thinking in terms of pensions, think in terms of survivor benefits. This was the first time that the federal government was going to experiment with this kind of payment to the families of soldiers who had given their lives for the cause of the Union. There had been pensions offered before. Back in 1799, the Congress had approved payment to naval officers upon their retirement. But when that naval officer died, the pension went away. Revolutionary War soldiers sometimes got payment for their services in the form of a land grant, but they did not get a financial settlement of any sort until Congress approved such things in 1828. For those veterans who had already died, their families received nothing. This was only to help out the Revolutionary War veterans who were still alive in 1828 and beyond. When the Civil War first broke out, there was nothing in place to help support the families of the soldiers who went off to war. Remember, early in the war, everybody thought it was only going to last for 90 days, and an awful lot of soldiers just signed up for that long. Nobody thought that there would be a lot of bloodshed or a lot of casualties, and so nothing was put into place to help out the families. Some communities started relief funds. A few states passed legislation to give the families of soldiers who needed it $1 or $2 or $3 a month. But by and large, there wasn't a lot of effort put into it because, after all, the war was going to only last a few months, and there weren't going to be that many casualties. Well, flash forward to the summer of 1862. In the summer of 1862, after battles such as Shiloh, Fair Oaks, the 7 Days, it became increasingly apparent that this war was not going to be of short duration, and it would not come at low cost. There were more and more families who were finding themselves without their family breadwinner and trying to figure out how they would go forward with their lives. And on top of that, Abraham Lincoln issues a call for 300,000 more soldiers. He's kind of stunned to see how slow Northern men are responding to that call. He wants to find ways to make it easier for them to volunteer for service in the United States Army. And one of the things that the Congress will push through to help out is what they would call the pension system. If you will enlist for federal service, then if something happens to you, we will make sure that there is an opportunity for your family to get some kind of financial support to carry on. It was a tool to encourage enlistments as much as a humanitarian gesture. The legislation was passed on July 14th, 1862. So by the time of Gettysburg, it's only been in place for about a year. It was a rather unwieldy system. It was kind of awkward. And the burden for participating, becoming part of this system, rested with the families themselves. When a soldier died, like I say, nobody's going to knock on your door and, like a casualty assistance officer might do today, and say, here are the benefits available to you. You had to know that these pensions existed, and it was up to you to initiate a claim to receive one. It was not easy, and oftentimes, especially a family of limited education, was going to have to rely upon a local attorney or a local government agent to help you out and to help you find your way through the system. It was always an interesting challenge for those who decided to try to get this money. If any of you were in our crowd today went to the First Corps breakfast, Gettysburg Foundation's First Corps breakfast back at the end of April, you heard me begin a talk very much like this, and then I made a promise. I said, you're going to hear me, or you're going to see me on schedules to give a talk about pensions in the future. And if you do, please don't think you've already heard the talk, because I promise to you, every time I give it this summer, I am going to reload and give new soldier stories at each opportunity. I do that for a very special reason. When we wrote our new field guide to Gettysburg, one of the 6 questions that we asked for each of our 35 stops was, who died here? And I threw the question out to the group at that breakfast and said, we know the generals. Name some privates and sergeants and lieutenants who died here. And after Wesley Culp and Amos Humiston and Cushing and Hazlitt and a few others, the crowd got silent in record time. But we know that over 7,000 soldiers were killed on the field of battle, and several thousand more died of their wounds shortly thereafter. Every soldier has a story. Every soldier has a family that has a story to tell as well. And so what I want to do today is to share some of those stories with you. Under the pension system that was established in July of 1864, there were 4 basic kinds of pensions that a soldier's survivors could apply for. They could only apply for one of these, by the way. There were mother's pensions, widow's pensions, minor children pension, a minor child is under 16, and the rarest of all, dependent sister pensions. Now, here's how the system is supposed to work. The soldier who will show us the way this is supposed to work is a private by the name of James Amsley. You can visit his grave up in the National Cemetery. He's buried up there. He was a private in Company H of the 107th Pennsylvania Infantry. He enlisted back in December of 1861. He will be hit up on Oak Ridge on July 1st in the afternoon. He will die of his wounds on the 9th of July. He is from over in Mercersburg, Franklin County. He lives very close by the Gettysburg battlefield. And there in Mercersburg lived his wife, Susan, and her 4 children, ranging in age from 10 down to 2. We don't know when she found out what happened to her husband, but she figured out pretty quickly that with 4 children, she better do something to make sure that her family could continue to thrive. So she filed for a pension. She began the process on August the 6th, 1863, less than a month after her husband's death. The way the system worked was simply this. Number one, you had to prove, in fact, that the soldier who died was formally enlisted into the Army of the United States. You had to have a statement from the Adjutant General's office stating when the soldier enlisted and his fate at Gettysburg. She was able to do that. Apparently, Private Amsley's records were in good shape, so that was not a problem. The second thing she had to do was to verify, in fact, that she was married to Private Amsley. She wants to claim a widow's pension. She has to prove this. This is easier said than done. The whole concept of a marriage license has not really been established yet. In the larger cities, they kept records of marriages. But in small towns like Mercersburg or Gettysburg or a lot of other towns, they didn't have such things. If you don't have that piece of paper, how do you prove it? Sometimes you could get a note from the justice of the peace or the clergyman who married you. Sometimes if you took your family Bible to an agent of the court, and if they could verify that you didn't go out and buy that Bible yesterday and put your marriage information in it, they would say that they would accept that as evidence. Sometimes, if they had no other way of doing it, if you could find a friend who had attended your wedding and come and swear an affidavit that you were there, they would accept that. Well, Mrs. Amsley was able to prove that, in fact, she was married. She also had to prove that the 4 children that she claimed were hers and her husband's were actually and legally theirs. No birth certificates either, so how are you going to prove that? The doctor who delivered them can provide an affidavit. Sometimes it comes from the midwife. Sometimes it comes from the man who was standing with your husband in the next room, who was pacing up and down with him, and then would actually write an affidavit saying, I was there with the prospective father, and I heard the first cries of life, whatever it took. Apparently, Mrs. Amsley was able to provide that information as well. The last thing that was required of any applicant for a pension was a declaration of loyalty. And basically, you just had to stand up and take an oath and say that you had never done anything against the war effort. And usually they didn't press the case too hard. You'd already suffered enough if you were applying for this pension. And she cleared all those hurdles. She applied in August. She received approval in December of 1863. And that's actually moving very, very quick. She actually got her pension. Her pension was $8. $8 a month. Now that pension, the fact that she received it so quickly was actually pretty amazing for a second reason. She actually had to file an addendum in the middle of all these proceedings because when her husband fell at Gettysburg, she was pregnant. And in September of 1863, she gave birth to a little girl. Her name became Mary Meade Amsley. In 1866, the federal government amended the pension law so that for every minor child under the age of 16 still residing with their mother, you could apply for an additional $2. And Mrs. Amsley went ahead and did that as well. She made her family's life as comfortable as she could. And as each child reached 16, that child no longer received the money, but usually stayed in the neighborhood and helped to provide support for the mother. Now that's fairly nice and neat and clean, but hardly any application for a pension ever went that nice and neatly. Let's take a look at a few more soldiers and their families' experiences. I pretty much can tell you that these are soldiers you have not heard of before. Let's look at mothers' pensions first. In this case, we will look at the case of Private John Pine, who was a private in Company I of the 3rd United States Infantry. He was born in Ireland, and he and his family had immigrated to Canada back in the 1840s. He became a locksmith, and he and his family in time had moved to the area around Rochester, New York. He mustered into federal service in August of 1861, and in the fighting out in the wheat field on July 2nd, he took a bullet in the left knee. The wound was a bad one. They had to amputate the young man's leg, and he died of his injuries on the 28th of July. The message went back to his mother back in Rochester. She started the process almost immediately to apply for a pension. Since her son had belonged to the United States Regular Army, it wasn't that difficult to verify his service through the Adjutant General's office. But then when she got to the question of establishing her relationship to her son, what she really had to do was to prove her marriage to John Pine's father. And that was one of those cases where she said, well, I think I need to explain myself a little bit more. And so she wrote an affidavit in which she wrote this: I was married in a private house in County Clare, Ireland, to Michael Keogh on July 6, 1847, the father of said John Pine, who has been known by that name and no other since boyhood. But Mr. Keogh, John Pine's father, had died of cholera in Toronto back in 1847. And then, as she continued, I married a second time to Thomas Pine about 15 years ago and moved with my family to New York. Pine, unfortunately, and this is his wife commenting here, proved to be an idle and dissipated man and done nothing for her support and abandoned us entirely. Frequently, I have written to him in regard to my destitute condition and my children and asking him to send money. And he would answer my letters after long intervals in abusive language. So she's setting herself up here. And in a rather unusual circumstance, the Pension Bureau allowed a minor, in this case, Mary Pine, age 15, the sister of the deceased soldier, to add in her comments as well. My father is a poor, drinking, and worthless man, crazy and of confirmed dissolute habits, and has no property of any kind. He left mother and us about 3 years ago, and now we do not know where he is in the western states. His being away is no loss as far as support is concerned, and if he were here, nobody could compel him to contribute to mother's support. But he would probably be put in some safe asylum. With affidavits like that, the Pension Bureau did not dither around very long, and they made sure that she got her, Margaret Pine, John Pine's widowed mother, or John Pine's abused mother, got her paycheck beginning in only about 6 months after she applied for it. Now, I've been focusing on mothers, and especially dependent mothers, but you'll notice I didn't say fathers. The law does not actually allow for fathers to apply. The assumption seems to have been that a man can always take care of himself, and so there was nothing there written for fathers. But before the word father, or before the word mother in the law, was the word dependent. Not every mother could apply for a pension, and if there could be dependent mothers, the possibility existed that there might be needy fathers who needed some kind of financial support. As this process developed, forms were actually put together that actually had everything printed on them: mother's pension. Some folks got really tricky and just crossed out mother and printed in father's pension and went forward with it just the same. The Pension Bureau didn't seem to mind. They entertained those applications just like they would a mother's pension, as it turned out. That was the case for Corporal William Gridley, Jr. of Company D of the 8th Ohio. We all know the story of the 8th Ohio, how they swung out and flanked Pettigrew's column on July 3rd and helped to send back the left flank of the great July 3rd attack against Cemetery Ridge. Well, Corporal Gridley was one of two sons of William Gridley Sr., who lived in Kent, Ohio. William Sr. had been married to Clarissa for many years, But she had died back in 1853, and he had been alone. Now, in 1863, he is 68 years old, and he's almost blind. He has a small farm, but it's heavily mortgaged. He had expected his two sons, Benjamin and William, to help him farm the land and to help pay off that mortgage. But then the war broke out, and both Benjamin and William enlisted in the Army. They joined different regiments, hoping that their different experiences would perhaps ensure that at least one of them came home safely. While they were in the service, they sent home part of their paycheck. William Sr. back in Kent, Ohio, regularly got at least $20 a month from the pay of his two sons in the Army. But then Benjamin was mortally wounded at the Battle of Cedar Mountain in August of 1862 and died 2 months later. And then son William Jr. was killed here at Gettysburg. If you want to visit his grave, he's buried up in the Evergreen Cemetery. Back in Kent, Ohio, local friends, even renters who rented out some of William Gridley's acreage, tried to help him keep afloat as long as he possibly could. But finally, when they ran out of other options to keep him afloat financially, somebody suggested that they apply for a father's pension to help him out. He applied in 1867. For 4 years, he tried to keep it going on his own. The submission was accepted. He received his $8 in 1868, and he continued to receive his $8 until he died at age 96 in 1891. So you could have both a mother's or a father's pension. But most frequently, the most frequent type was the widow's pension. Thus, these were always called the widow's pension files. If I mentioned the 73rd Ohio Infantry to you, some of you might remember one very famous member of that regiment, Private George Nixon, the great-grandfather of President Richard Nixon. Well, it's not his story that I want to tell, but that of a private in Company B of that same regiment by the name of William Call. Now, William Call was from Portsmouth, Ohio, and he enlisted back in November of 1861. He would be mortally wounded out on the skirmish line on July the 2nd, and he died on July 16th of wounds. He died, by the way, over in the George Spangler farm. And if you're a frequent visitor to Gettysburg, you may have been watching how the Park Service has been getting the George Spangler farm prepared for visitors. And with the Gettysburg Foundation and the Park Service, you can now actually take a shuttle and go over and see this wonderful hospital set up and have an idea of just what this was like. When you go over there, think about Private William Call. He'd been married back in 1857 to a woman with a most interesting name at this time of the year. Her name was America. America and William Call had 3 children. One was Effie, one was William, who was born on the 4th of July in 1861, and the third one was Liz, who wasn't born until October 19th, 1863. Her father never got a chance to see her. She applied for her widow's pension in October of 1864. She had to go through that same routine: the Adjutant General's office confirmation of her husband's service, proof of her marriage, verification of the children, and confirmation of her loyalty. She was approved in just a few months, and in 1866, she went and she got the $2 extra per month. She continued to collect until her death in 1888. And if you want to go and visit Private Call's grave, he too is up in the Soldiers' National Cemetery in the Ohio section. But sometimes things got complicated. I bet all of us, I love asking this question in a group like this. How many of us have seen the movie Gettysburg? Okay, we all know that there's that story at the very beginning about the mutineers of the 2nd Maine. Now, not everybody appreciates what their story is, so let me give it to you just very briefly. The story is simply this: at the beginning of the war, most regiments enlisted for 3 years, but some regiments only enlisted for 2. The 2nd Maine was one of those regiments. But some of the soldiers who joined the 2nd Maine after they were first recruited, whether knowingly or not, signed 3-year service papers. When the 2nd Maine completed its 2 years and went home, those who had signed 3 years papers still owed service. In their minds, they had joined the 2nd Maine, and when the 2nd Maine went home, they were expected to go home too. That's why they're so upset that they're still in ranks when they're on the march here to Gettysburg as part of the 20th Maine. The 2nd Maine and the 20th Maine story that we saw in that movie is not unique to that unit. In fact, that happened a lot. There were a number of 2-year regiments, especially raised from Maine and from the state of New York. And shortly after the Battle of Chancellorsville, many of those regiments headed back home. So there are a lot of regiments, both from Maine and especially from New York, who have just received an infusion of new troops that came from 2-year regiments that have gone home. One of those men was Sergeant Alexander Ross. He had enlisted back in 1861 in the 13th New York. Now, most of us, if we think about it, there's no 13th New York here at Gettysburg, and that's because that was a 2-year regiment that had just gone home. But Sergeant Ross had signed 3-year papers, and he had to finish out his service in another regiment. He will end up belonging to the 140th New York Regiment, Patty O'Rourke's regiment, up on Little Round Top. We all know about Colonel O'Rourke's death, but we don't hear about Sergeant Ross and what happened to him. He, too, was mortally wounded on July 2nd, and he will die of his wounds on the 9th. One of the soldiers who came over to the 140th New York with him, one of the old veterans of the 13th New York, immediately sat down and wrote a letter to Ross's wife, Anne, up in Rochester, New York. We don't have too many of these letters, but this is what one of them sounds like. Dear Mrs. Ross, I am sorry to say that Sergeant A.G. Ross, late of the 13th Regiment, has just died from the effects of his wounds he received in the battle. If he is sent for, we will put his name on a board over his head so he can be found if looked for. He was wounded on the 2nd, the ball passing through his left breast and lung. About a month later, there will be a message that will arrive in Rochester from Sergeant Ross's company commander. It will say, I have just heard of the death of your husband and am pained to know it. I had always found him a faithful officer and a brave soldier. You have lost in him a good husband and your children a kind father. Indeed, there were 4 kids that required some kind of support, ranging in age from 9 until 2. Probably because of that, Ann Ross began the pension application process on 24 July, only 2 weeks after her husband passed away. But there was a delay. It was a paperwork delay. Sergeant Ross's records were still filed with the 13th New York Infantry, and she filed him as a member of the 140th. The Adjutant General's report kept coming back. No records on this man, not enlisted in this unit. We cannot find this man. And for nearly 2 years, she kept applying and reapplying, trying to get someone to realize that he had just transferred from one unit to another before she finally received a payment in 1865. And again, it was that $8 a month. There were all kinds of complications that could pop up almost any time you can imagine. A miner's pension. In this case, we want to take a look at a soldier from the 26th Wisconsin, a sergeant by the name of Peter Rook. Peter Rook was a member of Company C of the 26th Wisconsin. He would have been a member of the 11th Corps. He would have been out on the 1st Corps, or out on the 11th Corps line on the first day of the battle. He had been born in Germany, and he and his family had moved here in the 1850s. When the war broke out, he was a clerk in a little store in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And in 1860, he had married a local woman by the name of Miss Hanson. About a year later, he had a daughter named Anna. Rook's wife apparently did not recover from the delivery, and about 2 months later, in early 1862, she passed away, leaving Rook with a tiny infant daughter. When the call came for 300,000 more men, Peter Rook wanted to go to the front. He needed to get away a little bit. But before he left, he arranged for a legal guardian for his daughter, Anna. He turned to his former in-laws, and they became her official guardians. Then the word comes through that Peter Rook was killed on July 1st at Gettysburg. It was up to Mr. Hansen to apply for a minor's pension because young Anna was well under the 16-year limitation. He ran immediately into several glitches. Number one, they could not find any adjutant general's records on Rook's enlistment. That's usually a stopper right there. They had to actually get a letter from a commanding officer in the regiment, a senior officer in the regiment, verifying that in fact he had served and was killed at Gettysburg. That took a while. The second thing that complicated matters was Rook's rank. Officially, he was a sergeant, but he had been promoted to second lieutenant. Just getting promoted doesn't mean that immediately you pin on your rank and you start collecting the pay of a second lieutenant. You actually had to be mustered in at your new rank. Rook had been killed before he was mustered in as a second lieutenant. So the question was, if we grant him his pension, if we grant his daughter the pension, how much should that pension be? As a sergeant, the daughter was only entitled to $8 a month. But if Rook is accepted as a second lieutenant, that jumps to $17 a month. It was a matter of some consequence. The paperwork goes back and forth through several different offices. You can imagine the VA system today and that kind of a problem. It wasn't any different back then. And finally, they resolved it to the government's benefit and decided that Peter Rook was only a sergeant and she would only get $8 a month. But she got it, and she would continue to receive it until she turned 16 in 1877. Now, that would be an interesting story alone right there if it stopped there, but it doesn't. Flash forward many, many years to 1838. It's August of 1938. It's August of 1938. It's right after the 75th anniversary here. It's right after all the national attention that was given to the dedication of the Peace Light and the last great reunion of the blue and the gray. 1938 is also the Great Depression. And all of a sudden, the Pension Bureau gets a letter from a man who purports to be Anna's son, or Peter Rook's grandson. And he writes this in 1938. While it's no fault of the government in any way, the deplorable part is that her grandfather invested the money for her with a man who became bankrupt, and the amount was a total loss. She is now in a position where any additional compensation would be more than welcome. And basically, he asked for the charity of the government in 1938 to provide a pittance for this woman who is now 75 years old. Perhaps at another time, the government would have found a way to do something for this woman, but they started checking into the case anyway. They wrote back to this alleged grandson of Peter Rook and said, give us details about this woman for whom you are claiming, or for whom you are asking for additional support. And there was a long delay in getting an answer. I suspect he was out trying to find out the right dates, the right names, all those details. I think he was really hoping for, oh, so sorry, here's a check. And when that didn't happen, the story got a bit more interesting. He found out, well, unfortunately, when he sent back a message, it said that the child's name was not Anna, but Nellie. He had the wrong date. He had the wrong date of birth, the wrong date of the mother's death. Every bit and piece was wrong. And when it came right down to it, well, they had to reject it. It seems that when they investigated, they found that this man back in Wisconsin was simply trying to play the system and trying to say that, well, 75 years have passed, maybe I can still pluck a heartstring here and there and find somebody to give me a few bucks, based on the magic word, died at Gettysburg. The rarest of the different pensions was the Dependent Minor Systems pension, Dependent Minor Sisters pension. I've looked at an awful lot of these pension files for Gettysburg casualties, and I have found exactly one of them so far. Sergeant William Babington was the first sergeant of Company C of the 12th Massachusetts. We can almost get a physical image of him in our head. He was only 5'7.5" tall. He had auburn hair, fair complexion, hazel eyes. He was a house painter in his civilian life. He enlisted in June of 1861. He would have been one of the first to answer the call, and he went into service as a corporal. His parents, John and Mary, had immigrated to the United States from Ireland back in 1853. William was the oldest of 5 children in that family. When he died here at Gettysburg, he was age 22. But he has younger siblings, 18, 16, 11, and 7. The war years were not good to the Babingtons. In 1862, the sergeant's mother passed away. In 1863, of course, he died here at Gettysburg, killed by a bullet on July 1st. In 1864, their father died. So that left 20-year-old Margaret to hold the family together. Somehow she learned about these dependent minor sister pensions and realized that 2 of the siblings, 2 of Sergeant Babington's siblings, Honora and Catherine, were still under 16. So she began the process. It was unusual for a woman to try to do this on her own, let alone one who had not hit 21 yet. But Margaret Babington did the same. About her brother, she said, "He was temperate and industrious. He paid the house rent and furnished the money for our support." And in order to validate her claims for dependency upon Sergeant Babington, she actually gave up one of the most prized possessions that a soldier's family could have, and that was the letters. The letters that he wrote home in which he said, "I am sending you a draft for $20. I am sending you a draft for $15. Confirmation that, in fact, he was sending home money to support his family even while he was in the service. You couldn't Xerox them or digitize them back then. She gave up the letters, one of the last ties that she had to her brother, in order to confirm, in fact, that her brother, her late brother, the sergeant, had always contributed to their support. They were accepted, but when it came right down to it, she had asked for support for 2 sisters, Honora and Catherine. Catherine was born in the United States, and they could verify her parentage and all that through baptismal records and all the like. But in the end, they would not give the money for Honora because she had been born on the ship on the way over to the United States, and they could not verify through any of the usual means that, in fact, she was the daughter or the younger sister of Sergeant William Babington. So the money was provided only for young Catherine, the $8 a month and only $8 a month that lasted until 1872 when she turned 16. Every soldier has a story, and in many cases those stories extend well beyond the Gettysburg battlefield. This was the first effort on the part of the federal government to try to provide long-term, lifelong, in some cases, support for the families of those who had served in the service of the United States. It would provide the foundation for the systems that we have today. Interestingly enough, these pensions were not administered by the War Department or the Treasury Department. They were administered by the Department of the Interior. It would only be after World War I that these Civil War pensions, combined with similar but not quite as elaborate programs for Spanish-American War veterans, and the challenges that were being presented by World War I veterans, or the Great War veterans, would combine into one office that became known as the Veterans Administration. And so Gettysburg's legacy to the families is something that we still deal with today. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for that interesting talk. Were there any Confederate pensions?
Always get that question. What about the Confederates? Well, the Confederacy, of course, does not last long enough to have a lifelong pension system going. If a Confederate soldier fell here at Gettysburg, what their parents or their wife could do is submit a claim to the Confederate War Department for any monies that were due them. And in fact, if they would take it and they would send it to a series of offices. They would check to see if the soldier was legally enlisted and all that, just like they did in the North. But they would also check and see if there were any outstanding balances. You know, had your soldier drawn an extra pair of shoes that was over and above your authorized allotment? Was there a bounty that was supposed to be paid to you, and did you receive it all? Of the accounts submitted that I've seen so far, when it was accepted and when there was a payout, it was always a one-time payout, and usually between about $80 and $120. Now, after the war, there would be efforts on the part of many southern states to provide some kind of relief for the families of Confederate veterans. But that was state support, not federal support. And sometimes that support came in the form of Confederate veterans' homes or orphans' homes or something like that. When the federal government wanted to try to promote reconciliation, they generally tried to find ways that didn't cost them a lot of money. One of the ways, and some of you might have seen this, was because it became an issue in the New York Times not too long ago. Think about it. When you think about United States Army posts in the South today, who are they named after? Let me name a few. Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, Fort Polk, Fort Gordon, Fort A.P. Hill, Fort Lee. Do we see a common stream? Yeah, they're named for Confederates. A lot of these were established as training camps for World War I. It was right after the big 50th anniversary and promotion of reunion, and the U.S. Army now needs training camps for year-long training going into World War I. So as a way to promote, to make it easier for United States troops to be on Southern territory again, they named many of the training camps after Confederate veterans, pretty much thinking that they would be temporary. Now, so many of them became permanent. Recently, some of you may have seen in the New York Times an editorial saying, "Isn't it appalling that we have posts established in the U.S. Army that are named for soldiers who tried to kill other U.S. Army soldiers?" So, you know, taken away from its original context, it's generating a new round of debate even now. But that's the way in which, in many cases, the Union would try to do something for Southerners.
What happened for the families of African-American soldiers where documents could not be provided on some cases?
What happened to the families of African-American soldiers? African-American soldiers that belonged to the United States colored troops were treated the same way. They were eligible to apply for these pensions, and in fact, a number of them did. Where it gets tricky, of course, is when you're dealing with such issues as literacy. If you're dealing with the free black population, where, especially if they lived in big cities and can establish marriages, and there are city records about births and that sort of thing, those applications are treated no differently than those claims submitted by white families. Where it gets a little trickier, of course, is when you have soldiers who had escaped from slavery who enlist because their marriages didn't have legal standing and all those kinds of issues. In those cases, they ran into a lot of problems. So there weren't any changes made immediately to the pension system to accommodate that circumstance. Later on, there will be, but immediately, at least during the war years, they're going to work with the system that they have.
Since the federal government couldn't just put it on a debit card, how did they actually physically convey that money from the Department of Interior to the recipients?
Since they couldn't, how did they convey the money to the actual recipients? A system of agents were set up. In a big city, there might be 2 or 3 of them. When it comes to a more sparsely settled area, there might be a representative in a county, and that person would get all the money due to pension recipients in the county, and then it would be up to him to make sure that the money was handed out appropriately. They didn't cut individual checks to hand out, so there wouldn't have been a 100,000 mass mailing at the end of each month or anything like that. They expected the agents to do this. And they discovered, of course, that some agents were very good at what they did, and some agents, they found some agents who were just absconding with the money and leaving, too. But that's the system they tried, and basically that was the system that they kept in place for at least about the first 10 years, and then they started dabbling with other ideas. I have to wait for Mr. Microphone here to move things around.
Okay. Regarding Confederate pensions, you might also want to mention about the pensions that were paid by the southern state governments after the war.
Yeah, there were certain circumstances where some states chose to add to the federal pension by adding states. Oh, yeah, well, no, that's what I said earlier. Yeah. Later on, there were some conversions of Confederate pensions to federal pensions. But that you have to wait for a while. You have to wait for the tempers to calm down. That's not going to happen until the 1880s and beyond. The fans up here make it really difficult to understand, so that's why I'm moving up sometimes.
I was curious. Can you hear me? I was curious. When did the federal government finally pay out the last payoff for the Civil War?
Well, if recent newscasts are to be believed, they're still doing it. There was, as the build-up for the 150th was just picking up steam, there were a number of accounts on the news saying that there were fewer than 10, but 4 or 5 or 6 or 3. Every account I heard had a different number. That they're still paying out pensions, usually using their children of. It's one of those cases where the 83-year-old vet married the 15-year-old girl, and this is now the 89-year-old kid who's around you. It's that kind of thing. But apparently we're still paying that bill. Okay, we're down to one more question.
Real easy. What was the average amount of time it took to open and close a case?
The question was, what was the average time to open and close a case? If everything went well, it seems that it takes about 4 months to open and close a case. But I saw a few cases in here because of those various glitches, because I couldn't find a certain piece of paperwork, that took over, in one case, 4 years. The only files that are preserved are the files that were successfully concluded, where they actually gave out a pension, and there were over 100,000 of them. You really had to be tremendously persistent in order to keep going and get these things and receive these things. We don't know how many pensions were started and they gave up because they got frustrated. We don't know how many got started and they just decided they couldn't find that one piece of information that they kept bugging you for. It would be really great if we had those pieces, because that would tell us a whole lot more about how the system works or does not. I've just been told I have to shut up now. So